Presumably, you've made your way here because you have an APS-C camera like the Canon R50 or the new ZV-E10 II, which is what I'm shooting this video on, and you're deciding which lenses you'll need to make videos. How do you choose? Why do you choose? What's the difference between using a 16mm lens and a 35mm lens when you're in the same room? I'm gonna go through a bunch of lens choices and show you what they look like when shooting in my studio and in my warehouse, and point out the main differences, as far as why you would choose one over the other. Also, this answer is different for different people in different situations. It all comes down to how much space you have, what's behind you, and how much of this place you want to show to the world. There's also this whole thing that people talk about with converting a lens by multiplying its length by 1.5 when you're on an APS-C camera compared to full frame. You don't really need to do that. If you're always just using the same camera, then the numbers are just going to be what they are. We're on APS-C here, so the lenses are just what they are. I don't need to be saying the 16mm is a 24mm full frame equivalent. That'll just make things more confusing. 16 is a 16. This selection of lenses represents every focal length all the way from 10mm to 200mm. And there's a few sweet spots in here because with the 16, the 30, and the 50mm lenses, each have a larger 1.4 aperture, which will dramatically change how everything looks behind me. For instance, here's 16mm at f5, and here's 16mm at f1.4. f5, f1.4, f5, f1.4, f5, f1.4. Not only is the background more out of focus at f1.4 and therefore less distracting from my middle-aged face, but also with this lens at this aperture, you don't need nearly as much light to properly light the room. f1.4 lets in like 4 times as much light as f5. Anyway, let's start at 10mm. And I'm gonna move the camera to reframe each shot so I look about the same in the shot. You'll see some of my desk and my upper body, and then you'll see what else changes when you do that. Let's get this 10mm on there. With this lens, the camera is just right on my desk, 2 feet in front of me. 10mm is a very wide lens. Some funny things can happen with very wide lenses. Things like fisheye distortion, where if I fill the frame with my head, this isn't what I look like. The picture will not look like me. Here I am back at 30mm with my head filling the frame, and this is basically the me I see in the mirror when I'm brushing my teeth or just gazing into my own eyes. This 10mm monster is some other thing. But this lens is great at arm's length, especially if you want the viewer to see the place that you're in. Oh, hello person on the other side of this video. This is my office. Over there is my home gym, and back at that desk is where I play Star Wars Outlaws rather than being productive. I will often use this 10mm lens on gimbals to show entire scenes because it's very wide. Cue the slow motion footage of looking at my kitchen. If I were to vlog, I think this is the lens I would choose also, because you can see me and you can also see the environment that I'm in. But I never use it for the purposes of a talking head. You can just see way too much of this room, and I am never gonna keep it tidy enough for that to be a net positive. That's not to say you can't or that you shouldn't. Casey Neistat uses a super wide lens in his studio from time to time. It's a very intimate style of shooting. We're right next to each other. Next, we're on to the 16mm. This lens is a go-to if you have to put the camera pretty close to yourself while shooting. And you would do that if you're either going to be shooting video in a small room or it's important to show a lot of what's behind you. Notice how you can see like 20 feet of the wall behind me. You can see the door that goes into this room all the way around to the edge of that shelving stuff. This same shot at 30mm, you get to see about half as much of the back wall. So to frame this shot in this way through 16mm, my camera is at arm's reach. You can still use a 30mm lens in a small room, and personally, I probably would, even if I had a small room. Here's what'll change. With the camera set up at a distance that makes me this size in the frame. So for the 16mm lens, that's like 2.5 feet in front of me. The 30mm lens, well actually let's see how far it has to be. To get that same framing, the 30mm lens needs to be about 5 feet in front of me. Both lenses work in a small space. Let's simulate a smaller space. I actually have this desk on wheels, so we can just roll it over to the back wall to simulate a smaller office. Although I look pretty close to the same through both lenses, pay attention to the shelves and the desk situation behind me when I switch between 16 and 30mm. So here's 16mm. You can see both these computer monitors. You can see my like locker set, a bunch of shelves, a bunch of junk. When I switch to 30, a lot less junk. You can still see both of these computer monitors, but no more lockers and just a lot less stuff. You just see less of the wall back there. And even though these are both f1.4 lenses, the longer lens will change 2 things. It'll blur out the background just a little more while also showing less of it, like literally less shelf space. It's zoomed in. The back wall is zoomed in behind me. 16mm, 30mm. 16mm, 30mm. 16mm, 30mm. At 16mm, lots of shelves. at 30mm, less shelves. By using the longer lens, you're backing up the camera a little bit, but zooming in the background a little bit more. When we go up another notch to 50mm in a small room, you're probably only going to be able to get just your head and shoulders in the frames because you'll run out of space backing up the camera. Now the camera is 10 feet in front of me. Well, I got a tape measure. To get this shot from 50mm, oh, 7 feet. Now the camera has to be 7 feet in front of me. Like these computer monitors are another 6 feet behind me. So now the background is even more zoomed in. You can only see a few feet of that wall. Actually, why don't we just find out? 5 feet. So with the camera 7 feet in front of you, the background 6 feet behind you, a pretty small room, you're only getting 5 feet of the wall that you have to dress up for your shot. That would be the benefit of using a 50mm lens in a tiny room, if you don't want people to see the crap that's not in this 5 feet of wall behind you. So for each of these examples, I've been moving the camera back to make it so that I appear the same size in the frame. So even though the 50mm lens is more zoomed in than the 30mm lens, you just move the camera back so that you, the subject in the frame, are the same size, and then it just zooms the background without zooming your subject. But then, of course, if the aim of your shot is to show yourself doing something, then a wider lens plays a different role. So instead of this 16mm lens being right up in my face, which makes me this size in the screen and shows more of the back wall, if I had an exercise science channel and I wanted to talk about proper deadlifting form when using a trap bar, well, first of all, I would clean up my room a little bit because it looks like absolute ass in here. But I would need the 16mm lens because it's wide enough to get a whole person in one shot. Because with the 30mm, the camera would have to back up like another 20 feet to get me all the way in the shot from head to toe. Then I don't have another 20 feet in this garage. And if you're outside, for instance, standing in front of a house, the difference between 16mm and 50mm is the difference between seeing the whole house or really just being able to see the front door. To be driven by either the limits of physical space you have in the room you're standing in or in the amount of the background that you want to be shown in your shot. If you have a tiny space, you're really gonna have to be limited to 30mm and below. But if you've got yourself a big room, here we are in my warehouse. Then you can start getting into longer lenses for even more control over what's in your shot. For instance, I would generally never choose 16mm in here for just a generally talking headshot because just look at how much of this ugly industrial space you can see on either side of me. What a mess. And instead of actually tidying up and being organized, I can just throw on this 50mm lens, back the camera up by 20 more feet, and then that same dank, boring, gray space just kind of melts away behind me. I mean, it's still there. This stack of metal cages back there just kind of becomes a texture of muted colors, contrasted by this stack of black plastic bins, which is just a darker muted texture of colors. The extra softness takes most of the distraction out of the background of this shot. So as an audience, you'd have an easier time paying attention to this box full of fire than whatever's happening in the room behind me, if that's what I'm filming. This is not really what I'm filming. Taking this a step further and going from 50mm to 85mm, one moment. And now at 85mm, I think you would basically never have any idea what sort of room I'm in. But really, all you can make out is this table, this forge, and me. Also, maybe don't put a forge on a wooden table for very long. It's super hot. And finally, using an 85mm lens in a big room framed up so it's just your head and shoulders in like an interview shot, this is gonna cause the background to zoom in so much that it's basically just an assortment of mushy colors that don't say anything, which is great if I'm telling a dramatic story that I really want you to listen to. This is a very attractive shot for storytelling, for interviews. Broke my microphone earlier today. I hope this is picking up sound. It's a really unique look, but you need a lot of space. The wall behind me, actually, I don't even know. My background is 30 feet away from my desk, and then the camera is another, I don't even know, 16 feet in front of me. It's a really unique look if you've got 50 feet of floor space in the place you're doing interviews. And since I've got it here and since I've got the space, we're just gonna take this one step further and go 200mm indoors. This is that same shot at 200mm, and to make this shot work, the camera is 100 feet in front of me. No, I guess this whole warehouse is only like 100 feet long. So really that camera's only like 60 feet in front of me. This shouldn't altogether look that different from the 85. I don't have a monitor up anymore because I don't have an HDMI cord that reaches across the room. At the very least, I would categorize this as inconvenient. Here's what it looks like for my camera. So this is where I'm standing and talking, and the camera has to be all the way back here. But it does have its place. Like for instance, look behind me again, the wire cages and the black plastic crates, you're only getting, I don't even know, my reach is about 6 feet wide. So you're only getting like 6 feet of background in a 100-foot wide warehouse. So if your budget for dressing up what's behind you is small, but you have a huge amount of space, like whatever I want that backdrop to look like, I would only have to dress up just a few feet of it. Versus at 16 millimeters, indoors, 200 millimeters, this is what that looks like. 200 millimeters, f2.8. I'm gonna take this thing outside. Here's a type of shot you may have seen before and wondered just what they're doing to cause this effect where you can see someone's whole body, but it's almost like there's just a sliver of the ground that's in focus, and then everything in front of me and behind me is kind of fuzzy. At 200 millimeters, we have to leave the comforts of the indoors behind, because with this camera, to get me framed up in this way, I have to be standing, I think, about 150 feet, maybe 200 feet away from the camera. It's kind of a weird shot, but it's a super unique shot where it's like it's wide, but it's also, the depth of field is so thin. So even though this lens has a maximum aperture of f2.8, because it's a super long focal length, you're gonna get way more background blur than with anything else. This is one of the lenses you'll see at the sidelines of NFL football games to get those magazine highlight shots of catches. People don't very often use a shot like this to get a talking head just because you need so much space. And the sun kind of sucks. And I broke my microphone and I'm going back inside.